Damn!
Back again.
Back again. Welcome to the Cinema Discovery Project. I don't know what that noise was supposed to be for.
I don't know, just imagine lots and lots of lasers.
Lasers.
I don't think we have that in the budget yet.
Yeah, I don't know why we need lasers, but I brought them.
Or just laser sounds like pew pew
Pew, pew.
Yeah.
But hey,
all that kind of cool
yeah, we're
stuff.
back here on the Cinema Discovery Project. I'm Stephen Billings, and
I'm Andrew Cabral. And
I'm not sure if you know who you are. It sounded like you questioned
I don't know these days I don't know who I am or
you're quarantined. You've been
quarantined
for well, you're usually quarantined, ain't you?
Right. Yeah. Well, it is officially day 21 of my quarantine.
Oh, really?
So so like at this point for me the days just like keep meshing.
Well, let me ask you, what day?
I keep forgetting what day.
What day is it?
Oh, it's Tuesday.
Okay. Right.
Because we record on Tuesdays typically.
Well, then
so
that's
now
a
I remember
giveaway.
that.
Never mind.
That's a dead giveaway. I know that's a little behind the scenes magic stuff. That's kind of like when you see like a clip of a movie without the special effects and you realize the whole movie's just made on a green screen and you're like, oh, come on, really?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, not exactly as cool as you thought it was. No, but we're back here for another episode, and it's been 2 weeks already, and this time we're going to be doing one of our overview episodes, I guess. We haven't done one in such a while. I don't know if we even have a series.
We haven't done, we've been, as we said last time, we've been dealing with a lot of, current stuff, and then we did our first spotlight in a while last time, which actually kind of coincides with what we're going to do this week.
Well, actually, our last episode, Stephen. So
sorry. You know what? I'm skipping last week's. I'm sorry.
Yeah, skipping last time's, which was we just did a whole episode on how this coronavirus is, affecting the movie industry and people's personal lives and stuff like that. But the one we did do before that was the spotlight on 5 Easy Pieces, which directly correlates to what we're talking about today, which is the new Hollywood era of American cinema. One could say, that's. Yeah, and I mean it has a couple of different names. This era, American New Wave, the Hollywood Renaissance, whatever you like to call it. Just call it the 1970s because it predominantly takes place in the 1970s. But it's an era that, I mean, I like to believe it started around 1967 and goes all the way up until 1980, 81, 82, around there. That seems to be the dates I see when doing my research. And it's an era in which we've mentioned several times because I think it's a very important era of American cinema history. Because I think it's a lot of precursors to a lot of things that we see now. And it's a precursor to all the big names we see now in movies for the last 40 years or so all come from this era. All the big time names, but it's actually my favorite era of movie history in general because it's one that I think latched onto very early in getting interested in movies. Stephen, how do you feel about this era in general?
Yeah, doing research for this episode, which I'd already known, a little bit about this era, but it kind of reaffirmed my love for this era of film too. We always think about the 70s as, the gritty, era, with a lot of a lot more violent, a lot more realistic. And that's definitely part of it, but a part of, I think the best part of this era that I love is that the freedom to the filmmakers. That's kind of what really is at the center of this movement, is that this was a time where filmmakers were kind of the king for a little bit, the auteurs, because before this, the Hollywood was just making the same movies over and over again, and it was just like a machine, kind of like it is now.
Very much so. Before this era, so let's say, I don't know,
pre-1965. Yeah.
Sure, why not? Or pre-1960s, you had what everyone knows as the studio era. The studios ran everything, and the stars, the big-time movie stars, or how they sold the pictures. They didn't really sell the pictures when it came to the filmmakers or things like that. It was always the big stars. I mean, Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn, Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, all these big type names.
And even these actors were signed to the studios.
Yeah, they had multiple year contracts. And what is interesting is today they kind of have those contracts too, but I think they're more loose and they're
more negotiable. I think.
They're more like multiple picture deals.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, oh, I owe this studio 4 pictures, but they'll still let me go and do this movie over here. Whereas back in the day, it was like, no, they pretty much owned you. It was kind of like a football, like a sports teams, like they own these players.
I think nowadays it more happens with the filmmakers or the producers. Like for instance, like Bradley Cooper, I think is signed deal with Warner Brothers because he's now producing a lot of movies instead of just acting in movies.
Right.
So.
Yeah, he'll have his production company will have a contract.
A lot of actors set up their own production companies and then become their own little studios that work with the big studios to make movies.
Right. But when it comes to this era, excuse me, I'm losing my voice already. I haven't even started yet.
Good
got a lot
stuff,
to say,
stuff.
which is not unusual. But a lot of what happened is this old studio system fell apart.
Yeah, literally, they were tearing down, sets and big, studio backlots, and
Yeah, they were. What happened is a lot of the old movie moguls started getting really old and passing away.
Well, some of them passed away. Some of them were, of course, they had old ideas and they weren't keeping up with the times.
No, they were still making like old Hollywood movie with the glitz and the glamour and the sheen and just the artificiality.
The big musicals. One of the big ones that stands out is Cleopatra.
Well, it's interesting that you say that directly, because Cleopatra bankrupted.
Fox.
Fox. Yeah. They bankrupted that studio to the point where they had to sell off part of their backlot
to a big conglomerate. Yeah, I mean.
And I know that movie today is considered a favorite amongst many Elizabeth Taylor fans and just movie fans in general, but it bankrupted that studio because it was so massive and so expensive. If you've seen the movie, it's just elaborate to the extreme, and it really bankrupted that studio significantly. But a lot of the other ones went under because, like I said, a lot of the old movie moguls passed away. So so corporations would come in and buy these studios. And the corporations that would come in, like who bought Gulf Western bought Paramount, and I think this was like an oil company or something, and they didn't know anything to do with movie making or how movies worked or how the industry worked. All they probably knew is that, hey, movies can make money, so let's buy this company and make money off of it. But they weren't movie people. I think the head of that company was Charlie Bluedorn, and he didn't know anything about movies. He was into Zinc and Sugar, as I saw in a documentary.
Yeah, he was like a crazy Australian guy.
He was an Austrian guy, and he didn't know anything about movies, but he wanted complete control over the situation, so you had to like pitch movies directly to him, and just crazy stuff like that. And then Warner Brothers was Jack Warner, I think, passed away at some point, or in the late 60s.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a little bit later. It's a little after...
but he was still around, but still just like, old, and just you had to really sell him on movies and stuff. Universal was actually probably the most stable one. Yeah. I think Lou Wasserman maybe was still running it. I can't really remember. But what was happening when all these studios were falling apart is the independent movement of the 60s was happening, and we've touched on it a few times. I mentioned Roger Corman many times, and he is vital to
he is
modern cinema. He's vital to just starting up the careers of everyone that we kind of really know. Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, just
Dennis
a whole
Hopper,
bunch of people. Dennis Hopper,
Jack Nicholson.
And Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, all of these people. And he was doing this all in the 60s, and he was doing it with really low budget B movies. B movies, nothing.
Yeah, what his thing is that he would give, he would let these guys work on movies, and then if he saw something in them, his talent more than anything was seeing talent in other people, and
Right.
if he saw talent in somebody, he would give them a chance. And honestly, I mean, the more I learn about Roger Corman, the more he becomes one of the maybe one of the greatest icons of film ever.
Yeah, and he's still with us today.
Yeah.
And he's still producing movies. Like his name is still on movies.
Yeah.
Like he's still around today. And back then his company AIP was American International
Yeah,
Pictures. And that's, like I said, that's where a lot of people got their start. And the thing is with these movies is they were drive-in movies and they made money.
Oh yeah, he was
they were made for nothing
money.
and made money.
He was
And
making
because
movies
people
that
loved
people
him.
wanted to see. He's kind of like, you could say he was the Blumhouse of his time, because he was making.
It's definitely the model.
Yeah,
definitely the model.
Really cheap movies and movies you wanted to see. Motorcycle gang movies and just crime movies, like wacky comedies.
Yeah, like Beach Blanket Bingo is a funny name that I always thought was interesting. But he would make horror, like Steven said, he would make horror movies. He would make beach movies. He'd make action movies, motorcycle movies. Wild Angels was one of the most popular ones. And the thing is with him is he would just give people, like Steven said, opportunities to just make movies. Like here's a camera and here's $20,000-$30,000. Go make a movie. Go see what you can do. And that's where Martin Scorsese started and all those guys. And what is interesting with that is he was tapping into the youth culture of the time.
Yeah.
And that is the big thing I would say with this whole new Hollywood era is it was a youth movement within the movie industry. And it was a youth movement that was catering to a young populace at the time.
Yeah, the war in Vietnam was getting ready to start, and so a lot of young people, were about going against the system,
Right.
fighting the government, being paranoid and all of the things like that. So these filmmakers, the Dennis Hoppers and the Peter Fondas, they were very much tapped into that, and they very much had something to say, and that's where it kind of this era starts to boom.
That's where the late '60s era starts to boom, and with the whole just huge political strife of the 1960s and just the American populace being more awake to reality.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, everybody's got with media and with television being how it is, because that part of the reason the studio system was failing was because TV was becoming so popular.
Yes.
So people were a lot more aware, and yeah, I mean it starts to really get crazy in the world.
Right, and with the world being so crazy, people kind of wanted the movies to reflect it or reflect their feelings about the world. And that's why all the old style movies, the movies from the golden age of like the 40s and the 50s and whatnot, those types of things weren't what people wanted to see anymore. So people didn't go to the movies to see it, but they went to the movies to see the Roger Corman pictures. And what came out of that is that the studios started picking up notice of this. They started noticing that these pictures are the ones that people wanted to see. But before then, the film that really kickstarted this whole movement is Bonnie and Clyde,
Yes.
the film by Arthur Penn and starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. And I think that movie is significant for so many reasons, because it's a film that really kind of gives us a glimpse of what modern cinema looks like. It had sex, it had violence, it had characters who were immoral. You know what I mean? These were bank robbers that were like killing people and police officers and running around, and they were based on true people, real people. And so that's a very modern concept, I think. Having morally ambiguous people, or even like rooting for the bad guys, seems like a very modern concept to me in movies. And Bonnie and Clyde was a big one, and it was a movie that took some doing to get made. And once it was made, people loved it. People and the studios didn't think that people would love it because it's especially that ending, is so controversially violent at the time.
Yeah, yeah. The writer Arthur Penn, or no, he didn't write it. He just directed it.
Right, Arthur Penn.
So Robert
he just
Benton
directed
and
it.
David Newsom, I think, are the writers, and they had written that, and apparently they knew Francois Truffaut.
Yes, which is kind of dope. I wish I knew.
Yeah,
him.
and so they got a lot of their advice about screenwriting from him, and apparently Arthur Penn had went to France also, and that's where they met, and that's how that got to where it got. When it came,
Yeah, they gave
because Warren Beatty was in France too, and
yeah, they gave Truffaut the script, and then Truffaut basically broke it down for them. This is how movie language works. This is how movie timelines work. This is how how the structure of the screenplay should be and the movie should be. I mean, that's pretty significant in terms of getting professionals help. And I do want to mention that I'm glad you mentioned Truffaut, because a lot of these people within the new era, the actors, the actresses, the directors, the filmmakers, everybody, hugely influenced by the French New Wave and the Italian films. Ingmar Bergman, Kurosawa was a big name that people mentioned. Ozu was a big name that people mentioned. All the people that
Godard
Stephen and I, Godard and Truffaut and Claude Chabrol.
Yeah, we did an episode.
All the people
we did an episode on
a million times.
We did an episode on the French New Wave. If you want to go back and listen to that, and
But all of the people that we mentioned and we talk about now in 2020, these were the same people that people like Spielberg, Scorsese, John Milius, Coppola, Bogdanovich, Dennis Hopper, all these people watched these people's movies in the 60s and were influenced by them like we are influenced by them. And it's fascinating how movies have that same power over generations.
Yeah, and
I find that to be fascinating.
And it's one of the first generations. They kind of talk about this in the documentary we watched, which is a great one. We watched a few, but Easy Riders and Raging Bulls is a great documentary on this era. This is kind of the generation where you have what we call film buffs. Well, we're film buffs, where there's a lot of education from watching movies, and it's a lot easier now. Then you had to still had to really find stuff. But these guys were very big fans of film overall, and they're more informed, and they are led by their passions a lot more than just having to spend so much time learning the craft itself. They've watched movies and they've learned the craft through watching movies. So
they did, and like Steven said, it was difficult. You basically, if you were in college at the time in the 60s, UCLA, USC, NYU, whatever, you would go to underground independent theaters to watch these movies, to watch La Dolce Vita, or to watch whatever, Persona. I remember Paul Schrader talking about going to see Persona and being inspired by that.
There was one part in the documentary that really excited me, and when they were talking about all the influences and stuff, one of the it was Dennis Hopper who said Satyajit Ray.
Yes, he did. Yeah. He was the only one who mentioned him. I think that was probably the first time I ever heard of Satyajit Ray when I watched this documentary 10 years ago.
I was like, holy shit. I have so much more respect for him now.
Yeah, he was a big fixture of that time, and people, I don't think, really remember him. There were a lot of people mentioned in these documentaries that were people whose careers really boomed at that time and then kind of faded away over time. But we'll probably get into a little bit of that
I would
later.
say it's probably a lot of it's because they dedicated themselves to that realm of film, in the sense of they didn't decide that they were going to continue to do big budget stuff. They stayed in the indie realm most of their careers. Most of their careers,
and also as we'll talk about towards the end, this era eventually did fall apart, did collapse, and then the movie world shifted into something else.
And then also, drugs and drinking and things didn't help their careers either.
I mean, we didn't even mention that yet. Lots of drugs, lots of alcohol. We're talking acid, cocaine.
Apparently, especially Dennis Hopper.
Yeah, oh my goodness. For those of you out there who are interested, watch Wim Wenders' film The American Friend and watch the making of that. And basically, Dennis Hopper was so just completely gone after filming Apocalypse Now that Wim Wenders had to basically put him in rehab and like just for him to sober up to do The American Friend. And man, it's just crazy wild times because these were all, like I said, young guys right after college. You know, a lot of them had graduated college in the mid to late 60s. People, they were in their 20s, 30s, in that era. And like the same way it is now, it's kind of the way it is then. People kind of go crazy when they're young.
That and just they were
they were
making a lot of money too. And
yeah, they were given a lot of power and just getting back on track. The movie that really kind of gave these young people lots of power is Easy Rider.
Yeah.
Easy Rider was a film that you can obviously still watch today, but it's a film that's low budget. It's a movie that's like, how do I want to say this? It's basically about the America of the late 60s. All of the feelings and all of that existentialism and all that kind of stuff was all thrown into that movie, and people went to see it in droves, and it made lots of money. And that's again when the studios were like, okay, low budget, and maybe let's start giving these young directors and people the money to make these movies because we can make money off of them because this movie just made a lot of money. Let's replicate that. Let's replicate that, which is what we see in movies now. How many movies now are, following
sequels and remakes and
try to make more money off of the same thing over and over. Yeah. Keeps happening. So that happened, and that was a huge thing. That was through BBS with Bob Rafelson and all the people we mentioned kind of when we talked about 5 Easy Pieces and all that kind of stuff. And those were guys that were interesting because they started their own production company.
Ray Burt Productions.
And they started, and they made 5 Easy Pieces, Easy Rider, King of Marvin Gardens, Drive, He Said. I'm probably missing another big one in there.
Yeah, they signed with Columbia.
Columbia.
Yeah.
Because they got in. Oh man, what was his name? Bert something. Oh man,
Bert Schneider.
Bert Schneider. Yeah, Bert Schneider, and he was the son of the head of Columbia Pictures. Yeah. So they got in with him.
Apparently, he was he was like the go-to guy. Like he had the drugs. He had, he was the guy that could get you things. He was like the cool producer. So many drugs. The hippie producer.
So they got in with him, and that's how they were able to get these films distributed, basically through Columbia Pictures.
And the thing that really got them started before this was the whole thing with the Monkees.
Yeah, I completely forgot about that. How the Monkees was a fake band for a TV series that was just like an American version of the Beatles. American version of the Beatles. Yeah. And then they ended up becoming a real band that like toured and made albums and stuff.
Yeah. But they wanted to make a movie, and the thing is the band who had already, I think, kind of like got broken up and like, but they brought them back and they wanted to do something more serious, and they made this movie called Head, which is in that BBS set.
It is,
and it's a very trippy, weird movie. Apparently, I haven't seen it yet, but so that's
it's very meta, very weird. But yeah, they did that, and let's see, there's so much information, but one of the biggest things that neither of the documentaries we watched really talked about it, and they talked about it a little bit, I think, in Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, was American Zoetrope.
Yeah,
which was Coppola, George Lucas, John Milius, Walter Murch was in there, and that was their production company, American Zoetrope, which still exists today. And I think Sofia Coppola and Roman Coppola are the ones who, like, they own it now or something like that, or it's under their name, but it's still around. But obviously not the same people involved. But this is where we get the heavy hitters coming in. This is where the studio starts signing up a bunch of these people. Paramount scooped up Coppola, and Universal scooped up Steven Spielberg, and all this kind of stuff was happening. But I mean, this is kind of like, not even film school 101, but I guess just like kind of pop culture movie 101. The Godfather is a very significant movie in American movie history because it's the one that started off Coppola's career, but it's the one that really became a massive success for someone who was part of this young group of filmmakers. You know what I mean? Like, it really proved that these young filmmakers can make quality movie and make lots of money.
Yeah.
Within the studio, quote unquote, their studio system, which wasn't really a studio
system.
And
without interference.
Although, like, he almost got kicked. I mean, you got to watch the making of that. He almost got kicked off of that several times while making it. They were gonna push him out like several times. But what made them stick with him is that he had the clout of winning the Oscar for writing the screenplay for Patton.
Yeah.
For starring George C. Scott. That really gave him the clout to do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted to do was get George Lucas's film made. And once George Lucas had made THX 1138, and the studio hated the heck out of that movie. They hated it. I personally really, really like it. I think it's one of George Lucas's most innovative things that isn't Star Wars. But once that kind of went down the drain, like, American Zoetrope kind of fell apart a little bit because, like, they didn't really have anyone to make anyone else other than Coppola. He was kind of keeping it afloat. That's a whole different story for a different time. But yeah. So The Godfather is a significant movie, early 1970s. He took concepts that were considered not considered I don't want to say immoral is not the word, but grotesque, or, you know, so you're not supposed to root for the bad guys, Steven. That's not the way the movies worked back then, but that's the way a lot of these films are. And that's one of the monikers, I think, of 1970s cinema, is most of the films that we think about, the main characters are kind of bad guys.
Yeah.
They're not white knights. And least of all, you know, Italian gangsters from, you know, whatever era that are doing all kinds of crime and whatnot. So with the success of The Godfather, of course, he got to make the Conversation. And of course, he got to make Godfather Part 2, got to make Apocalypse Now, and he also got to basically prop up his friends, get his friends jobs and whatnot. And he also, but he also kind of discovered a lot of people along the way, like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro. These guys were actors that they were plucked out of obscurity. Yeah. That's what's fascinating about this era, is all these guys that are just considered the best ever were plucked out of nowhere. You know what I mean?
I mean, like Robert, you know, if we're talking, you know, like Scorsese, you know, he brings in Harvey Keitel, you know, who's apparently they were like inseparable at the beginning, and with that came De Niro. They did
Mean Streets.
Yeah, Mean Streets was, you know, he'd already done, you know, what was the Boxcar Bertha with...
He had done Boxcar Bertha. He also had done...
Alice.
Who's That Knocking at My Door?
Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Film.
And Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which he had done right after Mean Streets. And that's a completely different film than I think a lot of people associate with Scorsese. But Scorsese was working primarily at Warner Brothers, which was being run by John Calley at the time. And John Calley was a bit of a character, as you could tell from the documentary A Decade Under the Influence. He ran Warner Brothers from he was one of the executives. He didn't run it, but he was in a high up executive from 1969 to 1981. And what I remember so distinctly about him is that he loved Mean Streets.
Yeah.
He loved Mean Streets so much. He thought Robert De Niro was someone they got from an insane asylum and put him in the movie because he was so crazy in Mean Streets. And I thought that was fascinating. Oh man. But there's a lot of other filmmakers.
I'd say one of the very important filmmakers of this period that came in was Sam Peckinpah.
Underappreciated Sam Peckinpah. His films are unlike anyone else's films.
I think, you know, as we're talking about how violent, you know, and how different this era is, a lot of that comes from his films. You know, his films really push the boundaries. Whether you're talking about Straw Dogs or or Stray Dogs or Straw Dogs.
Yeah, Straw Dogs. Yeah.
Or Wild Bunch is kind of the big Bunch. One.
Yeah, that was one done in the 69, I think, 68, 69. And that was what I find so fascinating about Wild Bunch, and Steven, I don't know if you'll agree with me, is that, like, people have this concept of Westerns, and I think movies like The Wild Bunch completely destroy that concept of the Western. Like, it's not a John Wayne Western, you know what I mean? There's no, it's very violent, very angry, very aggressive, and it kind of paints the West in a less rosy color than a lot of people like to think it was through watching movies. But a lot of that I think was brought out of the spaghetti westerns.
I was going to say the Italian
from
westerns.
Italy, from Sergio Leone. Those kind of changed the game as well when it came to westerns. But some of the other directors that I kind of want to highlight, Peter Bogdanovich is one of my favorite people in movie history ever, because he didn't start out as a film director. He started out as a fan.
Yeah.
And he started out as a fan of westerns, and he was on sets of westerns interviewing people and whatnot. He was very good friends with Orson Welles. He has great Orson Welles stories. He has great stories about Alfred Hitchcock, and he made a significant movie in the late 1960s called Targets, which I don't think anyone knows about this movie unless you're you're a cinephile or a fan, because Targets has got to be one of the most controversial movies made at that time. Came out in 1968, and basically it's a movie about a guy who just goes and sits on top of I think I forgot what it is. It's on top of something right off a highway, and he's just shooting people. He's shooting people in their cars on the highway, and for late 1960s, this is post Kennedy assassination, and it actually came out around the same time as Robert Kennedy assassination.
And they pulled it right after.
And they had to pull it. Yeah. They had to pull it after that. What I found fascinating about that production is Boris Karloff is in the film, and the only reason Boris Karloff is in the film is because he owed 2 days of filming.
They told him they'd already shot The Terror.
Yeah, The Terror.
Yeah, and they'd already shot footage for that, and they were like, the only way, he's like, I'll give you the money to make a movie, but you have to use this footage and work with Boris Karloff, for whatever amount of time he was owed to them. So
yeah, and that was a Roger Corman produced picture. And yeah, Targets is fascinating, but I think one of my favorite films from his is The Last Picture Show, and that's a film starring Sybil Shepherd in her, I think, first role. That's where she was discovered. Jeff Bridges is in that film. I believe Richard Dreyfuss is also in that film. I should probably look that up before I start saying things.
I think we might be thinking of
American Graffiti.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's let's see. Timothy Bottoms, Jeff Bridges, Sybil Shepherd, Cloris Leachman, Ellen Burstyn. No, you're right. Richard Dreyfuss is not in that film, but he was around in that era.
Yeah, he was in American Graffiti, which is George Lucas's kind of big first movie.
Yeah, which is the one that he once Coppola got like I said, got all that power, he was able to kind of get Universal, I think, to make American Graffiti, with George Lucas at the helm. But what were we saying? Oh yeah, Last Picture Show. But this was the film. Yeah, that was shot in black and white, which was 1971, a film shot in black and white, not really something that you saw. Not even the B pictures, I don't think, were shot in black and white for the most part. But it just captured a certain old-fashioned aesthetic that I don't think a lot of the films at the time really captured. It's an amazing film. I highly recommend anyone to see it. But yeah, there's so many stories that go on behind the scenes about that film. But another filmmaker I think is really important, and it's a filmmaker I didn't know a lot about until I saw this documentary, years and years ago, and that's Robert Altman.
Yeah.
Robert Altman was massive back in that time. And Robert Altman, I don't think gets remembered a lot because he never really made mainstream cinema post this era.
Nashville was his biggest hit, kind of.
Yeah, Nashville was kind of his biggest movie. I think at that time, although MASH is really big, but he of course made movies after that era. I mean, one of his last films was Gosford Park, which I think is a great film. But he made The Player. He made Shortcuts. Um, I mean, his most mainstream film, and it's not the best even, is the live action Popeye film starring Robin Williams, circa 1980. But yeah, back in that time, he made films like you said, Nashville, The Long Goodbye, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, MASH. He made MASH, Three Women, which is an insane film starring Shelley Duvall. Just a crazy, crazy movie. But he was just massive influential at the time. You also had Paul Mazursky was another name I did not know about. Monty Hellman made the film Two-Lane Blacktop. So many people that you just don't know about if you don't really look at this era, because a lot of their careers really didn't go past this era. I mean, William Friedkin, his two biggest films and his biggest claims to fame are two films he did in the 1970s. I don't think very many people remember what he did past that time when he did The French Connection as well as The Exorcist.
Yeah. What ended up killing him was the Saucer film.
Yeah, Saucer. Which is honestly a great film. I've
seen it. Yeah, it's okay. I mean, it apparently flopped though. But it's basically it's a remake of
Wages of Fear.
Yeah.
Or it's a readaptation of the book Wages of Fear. Either way you look at it, it's nearly the same.
But he kind of goes down. He loses his kind of like weight with the studios after that. But one of the big events that happened early on in this movement is the stuff with Roman Polanski.
No, I wasn't even going to mention it. I guess if you want to bring it up, sure.
Well, it's kind of a big part of that whole, just like the Kennedy assassination,
Yeah, there are two major events that happened with Roman Polanski, both extremely tragic for many, many reasons. The first of all, he was one of the directors that people mentioned that were influences on him because he had done Knife in the Water, and
Repulsion,
Repulsion, and the films he was doing overseas, which are really good. I mean, he is a great filmmaker, terrible human being, great filmmaker back in his day. But of course, what happened, which we talked about significantly when we talked about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Quentin Tarantino's film, is Sharon Tate being violently murdered by the people from the Manson cult, and that was another thing that was part of the culture of the time, the violence, just the brutality and the insanity of humanity.
That whole scenario, like what the change that was happening in cinema happened in real life, where the public wanted to see things that were more reflective of real life, and in a place where dreams come true, the fantasy becomes, gets put on the pictures. One of these famous people gets killed. The
reflection of it's really tough to it's kind of like today, which is interesting about today is we're inundated with so much violence and just horrific things in the news that people want that escape now versus back then where people just wanted it. People were just like, they were
looking for truth.
Reality works.
They were looking for truth.
Yeah,
they were
people
sick
wanted
of
truth.
Hollywood trying to reflect America that everything's all happy-go-lucky, and it's not. They needed an outlet. They needed somebody to express what they were really feeling.
Very true. I mean, a lot of several of the other directors you have, of course, Sidney Lumet. Man, Sidney Lumet in that era was just putting out fantastic
prime
work.
Stuff, yeah.
Prime stuff. I mean, he did do The Wiz, which isn't well received by many, but before then he had done Serpico. Oh yeah, Pawnbroker is a film no one talks about, which they really should. But he was doing, of course, he started with he started in television like several other people had. But yeah, The Pawnbroker was 1964. He did, where am I looking for? Where are you? Network, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, There's three just fantastic films. Like anybody would wish to make three great films like that. His career he definitely went on to make other films like The Verdict in the 80s. And I think, coincidentally, I think his last film, which came out in 2007, is a fantastic film.
Yeah.
Before the Devil Knows You're Dead. That's a great film. Philip Seymour Hoffman, Ethan Hawke is in that film, Marissa Tomei. A really great film. But he's a name I didn't know until I had actually gone back and seen all these films. Another one that's significant to me, is someone like Mike Nichols.
Yeah.
Mike Nichols was made, one I think of the seminal films of the movement early on was The Graduate.
Yeah.
Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman had a crazy great career launch with all of the films he did in that era, all the way up until like the mid '80s. He was just having just one hell of a
Cowboy,
run,
which we talked about,
which we did. But Mike Nichols did The Graduate. He did Catch-22, Carnal Knowledge, starring Jack Nicholson. But also, we can talk about it, but George Lucas obviously probably had one of the most lasting legacies.
Yeah, I mean, as we get
as well
later
as
into
Spielberg.
the 70s, which this era basically covers the 70s.
Yeah, it's predominantly the 70s, and we had, Spielberg got his start doing, wasn't his first film
He did Duel, and then that sparked the interest of Universal, and that's what got him signed to do Jaws.
Right.
Which is,
and then he did Close Encounters.
you could say Jaws we talk about this a lot.
Jaws is the turning point.
This is the turning point in this era where we start to see
the early. There's like two parts to this era. There's the early part, which is like the rise. You know what I mean?
Think
Like all
about
these
think
people
about
we've been
the
talking about.
recent Apes trilogy.
Yeah.
The rise of the Planet
Good
of the
metaphor.
Apes, and then in the middle we got the Dawn, which is when Spielberg makes Jaws, and then whatever the last movie was called, I don't remember.
Oh, War for Planet of the Apes.
The War.
Where things are a little dire in that film.
And now the studios have gained control back again, and the war is over, basically.
Yeah, the war. Well, yeah, or
the
the war continues in a different form. But what is interesting about that beginning era is just the wildness and how there were no rules. Like constantly when I was watching these documentaries, people were talking about how they could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
The studios gave them whatever they wanted, whatever amount of money they wanted, whatever amount of just freedom they wanted, and they just lapped it up. I mean, you had, it's just wild stuff where people would just be like, all these big time names who were just starting their careers at the time would just be hanging out at like people's houses and like doing like smoking weed and just like talking about shit.
Well, like movies like we talked
like,
about Easy Rider. I mean, they were actually doing drugs during the making of the movie.
Oh, I believe that.
Yeah, they were smoking weed and things that you couldn't get away with now.
No, I mean you could try.
I mean, you could. I mean, if you were a small independent movie, sure, but like Hollywood movie, no.
Yeah, they got producers and executives and corporate people all over you all the time just to keep you in line, to make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You can't be going too far out of that line for the most part.
Well, there's too much money involved in movies, now.
Yeah, there's so many politics and contracts and all that kind of stuff that affects your ability to direct and all that stuff. Another director, which I know a lot of people don't like these days, and we talked about Polanski a little bit. Chinatown is a seminal film in that era. Unfortunately, the other thing that Polanski committed a horrific crime that he still really hasn't paid the penalty for.
He had to flee the country. So
he had to flee the country. I mean, he's still a criminal. What's that? What's that term? Escape from justice or something like that. He's not a good guy. Like we said, not a good guy. But another person who a lot of people don't like and who got his career started in this time, and it's kind of his prime, well, more like the 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s, is Woody Allen.
Yeah.
Woody Allen's films are completely different than the other films of these people we've been talking about. Completely different. His films are a little more they're a little more old Hollywood.
Yeah.
Because I always have had this conversation, maybe jokingly, is like there's Martin Scorsese's version of New York in the 70s, and then there's Woody Allen's version of New York in the 70s, and they're completely different worlds. Like, you wouldn't think that these are the same places. Like, if you watch Taxi Driver versus watching Annie Hall, they're completely different places, but they're both New York in the 70s. But Woody Allen, he brought in a lot of kind of simplistic filmmaking. A lot, the two shots, the walk and talks, the films based on predominantly dialogue, things like that. That was a lot of his stuff that was introduced. Very, neurotic, introspective lead characters.
Well, he puts himself in almost every movie.
Yeah, and they're basically kind of fictionalized versions of himself to a certain point.
He's definitely a writer before he's a director.
Yeah, I wouldn't watch a Woody Allen film to really learn about the ins and outs of
cinematic language necessarily.
Yeah, although to watch cinematic language, although he had one of the best cinematographers who I believe had also shot The Godfather, and that was the Prince of I think they called him the Prince of Darkness. What was his name? Looking him up right now, Gordon Willis. Gordon Willis, who they call the Prince of Darkness. I don't even call him the Prince of Darkness. King of Darkness, Prince of Darkness. I don't know. It was something to do with darkness because the way they purposely exposed, or they purposely developed the film, or shot the film, or developed whatever you want to say. I'm losing my mind here. Of The Godfather to look dark, really dark, so that the studio couldn't So the studio couldn't fuck with it. So it's they purposely made it look like they couldn't see shit so that the studio wouldn't mess with the movie, which I thought was kind of interesting. That's why they called Gordon Willis, Prince of Darkness. But he shot a lot of Woody Allen's work, which doesn't have the most suave aesthetic. Yeah. You know what I mean? His films are very, the two shot and not a lot of coverage. Very basic filmmaking. It's kind of as much as people do not like Woody Allen for several controversial reasons, if you're a young filmmaker out there, someone who's looking for the aesthetic basics of making your first film, like a student film or something, you may want to take a look at Woody Allen's films because they're basic and they're easy to learn from and easy to translate from. And that's kind of where I learned a lot of
the thing is it's a conversation you have. Film people have all the time. Style over substance, vice versa. Right. And sometimes it just depends on. I mean, they're definitely interlinked, but sometimes maybe you're not as interested in being stylish, and you're more about caring about the telling interesting stories or interesting talking about interesting characters, and maybe you don't want to have as much of a stylish flair with your filmmaking. So somebody like a Woody Allen who has continued to work for 50 years, though he is not so dynamic as a director, he still continues to make things that people want to see. So you don't have to be the Zack Snyders or the Ridley Scotts where you have very distinct visuals to be a good filmmaker. So
no, everyone has their own style. Yeah. I mean, speaking of someone who has their own style, Brian De Palma, who was actually part of that whole group, I mean, he was making his own versions of Hitchcock movies, but with his own style. That was kind of predominantly a lot of his work with Sisters and Carrie and what's the one with Michael Caine? Of course, it's not here when I need it. Dressed to Kill. Yeah. That's the one. Dressed to Kill with Karen Allen. Not Karen Allen. She was in RoboCop. I'm gonna.
Why don't you know?
I don't know why I don't know this. I'm losing my mind here. But Nancy Allen, not Karen Allen. Yeah. Karen Allen was in Raiders with Harrison Ford. But people like George Roy Hill, John Carpenter was getting his stuff done in the 80s. In the 70s, we talked about that 70s era of horror films, and we talked about the horror films. But yeah, there were a lot of people prominent people doing work back then, and they were making their own films. It was auteur filmmaking in a gritty style. These, like we've said before, the aesthetics of 1970s cinema are dark, gritty. They're ugly-looking films for the most part because they're so, they're so like stuck in reality. Reality at that time was being interpreted as a very ugly world to live in. Something I wanted to touch on, Stephen, and maybe you'll let me touch on because I just keep talking,
Sure.
is unfortunately when it came, all the names we've mentioned have been prominently men. Women did not get the luxury of behind the camera as men did in this era.
Yeah.
We've talked
At
about
least in
before.
America.
At least in America. I mean, a couple of filmmakers. I mean, Elaine May made Mikey and Nikki, which is a really good 1970s film in my opinion. John Cassavetes and Peter Falk, I believe. But what they lacked behind the camera, I think we got a lot of great actresses getting their career started in front of the camera in the 70s. Would you say that, Stephen?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's definitely still a lot of great actresses going on in that time. I mean, and a lot of them would go on to be probably, to be on producers on things, and just kind of like a lot of females today. Whether it be your what's her name, that just did the Charlie's Angels movie.
Oh,
Elizabeth Banks becoming a very,
Right.
a director, producer.
Oh, yeah, I will say this. Women were still, of course, working in the industry. But when we look back at that era, like, we always remember all the big-time male names.
Yeah.
And not necessarily the female name.
Well,
unless we're talking about actresses.
Yeah.
Unless we're talking about actors. Because I mentioned Sybil Shepherd, Ellen Burstyn, Cloris Leachman got her start there. Meryl Streep got her start in the 70s as well.
With
That's a
Sissy
pretty big name.
Spacek.
Sissy Spacek is another big one. You also had Jodie Foster got her start in that era. Karen Black, which we mentioned when we did 5 Easy Pieces. Diane Keaton. I mean, we just talked about Woody Allen. Shelley Duvall. Jamie Lee Curtis got her start back then as well. She was the first Scream Queen. Of course, the late, great Carrie Fisher was of course, in Star Wars and whatnot. But she was in more than just Star Wars. But a big one for me is Gina Rowlands, who was in a lot of John Cassavetes' work because they were, I believe, married.
Yeah.
So they were, of course, she was, of course, his lead in a lot of films. And they mentioned Cassavetes a lot in one of the documentaries as being an influence because he's kind of like the father of American independent cinema because his films were just so, they were independent films. He would just take the people from his acting class.
Yeah, I was gonna say
and get a camera.
Yeah,
and just
they
make a
very
movie.
much were. He was a very big influence on that guerrilla style of filmmaking, where you would, because a lot of you didn't want to go, you didn't have the money to get permits, so they would just go and shoot on a street until the cops were called.
Yeah, which is, I mean, people still do that shit today.
Oh yeah,
but,
I mean, honestly, whenever I decide to make my first thing, that's probably what I'm gonna have to do.
Oh yeah, what is permits?
Yeah, I don't have. I
No,
can't go
thank
through
you.
the proper channels here.
I know, proper channels. You have to pay for those
Yeah.
things. It costs money. You gotta schedule time and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. It's a problem. Forget that noise. But Gina Rowlands was in. She was in Faces. She was in A Woman Under the Influence, which is an amazing film. From the 70s, and Ellen Burstyn is another actress who is, she's still around today, but she got her start back then, like we mentioned. She was in The Exorcist.
Yeah.
She was also in the Scorsese film Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. She was in The Last Picture Show. Great, fantastic actress. Yeah, she's won an Oscar. I was gonna say, did she win an Oscar? She did. She won one for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Yeah. But some other there's so many actors I want to mention. Goldie Hawn got her start back then.
Oh yeah, well, Sugar Land Express
Yeah. Mia Farrow.
with Spielberg.
Yeah, Faye Dunaway, Jessica Lange, Julie Christie was a prominent. They interviewed her a lot in A Decade Under the Influence. Pam Grier, they interviewed her, and that's another part of the 1970s that we didn't talk about was the black exploitation era, which was those were B movies.
Well, them were
starring
probably
people like
drive-in.
Pam Grier.
Them were
Those were drive-in movies.
drive-in / your grindhouse theaters and
Yes.
yeah.
And she was and some of the titles for some of the movies she was in were very interesting titles, like the Big Bird Cage and Black Mama, White Mama, and there's just a woman called Women in Cages and the Big Dollhouse, which is apparently there's a whole subgenre of women in prison movies. I didn't know.
It's a fetish. It's a fetish for men, apparently.
I don't know if it's a fetish, but it's a thing. But she was in like Coffee and Foxy Brown and those types of movies. When I think of that era, I think of Pam Grier. I also think of Shaft,
Dolomite.
Yeah, Dolomite. Yeah. Dolomite. I also think of Superfly. Those movies and whatnot. And those were all part of that era too. And there's very, very interesting just this cross pollination of all these kinds of different movies back then, and just the different genres that were meshing with one another, and just there was so much to consume, and it's kind of a precursor to now how there's so much to consume. But as all good things, Stephen, many good things have to come to an end eventually.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to segue into the second half of this era.
Yeah.
Which honestly, we're making it sound like everything went to shit, but I mean, we got some pretty great movies out of it.
Well, I mean, it doesn't go to shit, but that
there's a shift.
There's definitely a shift where the studios, kind of took control again. And it makes sense. The studios are going to stand on the shoulders of the hardworking filmmakers that got them back in business, and then take the keys away from them again, and start investing money in these kind of started what we now call tentpole movies. With filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, making, Jaws kind of blew everything up, and then Star Wars came next, and then, then Spielberg would continue to make big movies like Close Encounters.
Yeah. And
even flops like 1941.
Oh, yes. Like 1941. Well, what happened is, like Steven had mentioned, like these big movies came out. Star Wars changed the game.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Star Wars, I mean, we talk about Star Wars ad nauseum, Steven and I, and everyone seems to nowadays because it's still around. But people get sick of it, like, Star Wars, whatever that movie, what people look down on it now because it's so popular. But man, back in the day, back in the 70s, Star Wars, it was unlike anything else ever made to that point, pretty much. Like, it even exceeded Star Trek, because Star Trek always had Star Trek was different. Star Trek's like very, very different in tone, different in style, all that kind of stuff. Sci-fi was different. You had a lot of dystopian films from the 70s, but you didn't have like all the sci-fi stuff was cheesy and not serious. Although Star Wars when it was made, was probably considered a B movie because it dealt with a genre that wasn't taken seriously. And it probably wasn't until Star Wars that it got taken seriously for the most part, especially with Empire Strikes Back and then the whole 1980s and the huge, sci-fi fantasy, explosion that was the 1980s. But no film was made like that. It was 20th Century Fox was doing it. George Lucas was doing it overseas because the way he had to do it because of the cameras and the technique and all that kind of stuff. There's a whole thing about the making of Star Wars that many people can watch. Empire of Dreams, I think, is the documentary, or you can watch even the American Zoetrope documentary that's on the THX 1138 DVD and Blu-ray is really fantastic to watch. Goes into all that kind of stuff and just really how genius George Lucas was for doing Star Wars. Granted, he was taking a lot of influence from stuff he already knew from the past. So it's not like he thought all of it up by himself. He was taking influence from things from before, like everyone has done. But when it hit, and it hit, and it was a massive hit, this is when we got like the cross culture of movies can now be mass marketed to make money off of other things than just the movie at the box office.
Yeah, merchandising, toys and we started cross marketing things in a different way. Movies became more integrated into a lot of other things than just going to the theater, and commercials on TV and toys and theme parks, and it blew up.
Yeah, merchandising. That's how Yogurt says in Spaceballs. I would love a new Spaceballs movie today, but that's a different thing. But George Lucas, didn't he retained all the merchandising rights because they didn't think it was going to be worth anything.
It was going to fail. Yeah,
that's how he made all of his money, is because of the merchandising from Star Wars.
Apparently, if this didn't work out, he was going to do porn.
Oh, I'm glad you watched that, because this has been something I've talked about with my close friends for years. It's like John Milius said it in the whether it's true or not, who knows. In Easy Riders Raging Bulls, John Milius says, if it didn't work out for George, he Milius suggested he go into pornos, pornographic films, and Milius is who knows, today he could have had a whole porn empire. And I was like, okay.
He'd probably have made more money today than he ever.
John Milius is a very interesting human being. For those of you out there who want to know more about John Milius, watch the Milius documentary that was done a few years ago, because it's amazing. He's a very interesting character, and he was great writer behind a lot of stuff like Dirty Harry and Apocalypse Now, and he directed one of the Dirty Harry movies, which is probably the best Dirty Harry movie. I can't remember what it is, but he did, of course, wrote Conan the Barbarian with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was very fascinating, man. But yeah, apparently that was the thing, which coincidentally was also kind of an industry that was booming in the 1970s as well, which I guess a story for a different time. But if you watch the movie Boogie Nights, where of course it's fictionalized, but it takes place back then, and you can kind of get a glimpse of that industry, the adult entertainment industry booming in the 70s, because things were changing. One thing we didn't mention is kind of the reason why all these filmmakers were able to make movies that were so gritty and so real and so, sexual and perverse and all that kind of stuff, is because the old Hays Code, which we talked about once upon a time when we did our censorship episode, was thrown in the trash in the mid-'60s and replaced with the MPAA, where you could have PG and now R-rated movies. You didn't get PG-13 until later on, so you could make movies now with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Yeah,
basically the studio, they were waiting for somebody to finally, though they threw the code away, they were waiting for somebody to step up.
Yeah.
And nobody was stepping up, and then finally, Bonnie and Clyde kind of was the first big one.
Yeah, Bonnie and Clyde kind of pushed it, and then you got to start seeing more R-rated films, like what we consider now adult-oriented films, with things not for children. But when it came to the another thing I want to mention in the late era was, like you said, the flops. The flops kept coming, and once they kept coming, the studios weren't happy with the young bucks that they had, given the keys to the castle.
Well, the thing is when you talk about the type of movies that they want to make, there is a risk.
Yes.
It's either going to have an audience or it's not. Doesn't mean that the movies are not good, but they're about money and not about being being an artist. So when the studio started snatching up and putting out these guys' movies, they became disappointed with because weren't getting the returns they think they should have been getting,
that they were getting from before.
Yeah, but also the war, I think by the end of the 70s ended. Over. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that kind of happened too, where there was a culture shift. Once Vietnam was over, I guess people really didn't want.
They didn't want to be reminded
to see these movies anymore. Yeah, they didn't want to see it anymore. The post-Vietnam era, they want to go back to happier things, I guess.
It kind of. You could say though. They do say Raging Bull's kind of the end of this era. You also have Apocalypse Now, which was right around that time too.
Yeah, 79.
Yeah. So.
But some of the flops, like we were saying, are flops or movies that weren't received well, or films that I think are amazing. Now, there's one film here that's considered one of the all-time kind of death knells of this era, and that is Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's film, which is a film you've seen, which I haven't seen, but I have it, and I almost watched it, but it's like a 4-hour movie. So it's like,
you're in quarantine. Watch the goddamn movie.
Yeah, I know. Seriously, I got all the time in the world. I'm in a time
Funny
machine,
enough, I just watched another one of his movies. I watched the Year of the Dragon.
Oh, cool. Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah, so his career didn't die, but it didn't
fizzled
quite
out
recover after Heaven's Gate.
Yeah.
Yeah, Heaven's Gate is 3 hours and 39 minutes long. This movie apparently was during its production was such a hassle. Like, it was like, I mean, apparently it costs all kinds of money, and it's just so elaborate not so elaborate to make, but it's like, apparently it was very difficult.
You could say it almost kind of killed the Western, too.
Yeah.
In a way, for a while.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the 80s ain't full of, Westerns.
I mean, you've got, Young Guns.
That was basically the 90s. It was near the end of the 80s
kind of true.
That came out, I think.
I guess that's kind of true. Yeah, there was definitely, and
it wasn't until you had Unforgiven, I think you got your
90,
which is your last great kind of Western.
When was that? 92?
Yeah, 92.
Was Unforgiven? Yeah. But I mean, what is interesting is you still had Clint Eastwood in the 1970s. Was another one who made his he didn't make his he made I would say he made his filmmaking not resurgence, but like his filmmaking career kind of started back then, because he was already doing movies in the 60s. He had already done the Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns.
He was moving on from being just the Western guy.
Yeah, he was moving on from being a cowboy to kind of being a American cowboy in modern day.
He was doing the Dirty Harry movies.
Dirty Harry's basically it's his character from those movies, but in a modern cop sense. Yeah, it's kind of what he got his name for. Clint Eastwood, his claim to fame. But yeah, he was making a lot of movies in the 70s.
I think he did his movie. He did The Beguiled in the 70s. The original Beguiled.
I think you're right, but I'm trying to see what his directorial debut was.
That's shoot.
What's that called? I have the movie.
I have the movie too.
It's Play Misty.
Play Misty for me.
I don't have it, but he did direct that. But he also did High Plains Drifter. Yeah. The Eiger Sanction. Outlaw Josie Wales is considered one of his best films. Yeah, he did a few more, but then we get into the 1980s. But I think he was in more. He was acting more than he was directing. But I think that's where he got his directorial start, was back then. Yeah, but you're right. It is The Beguiled. He was of course in all the Dirty Harry movies.
Dude, there's like
Magnum
6 Dirty Harry movies.
I've seen them all. Actually, I own the whole box set. I think there's 5 or 6. The last one's not good. The last one's just called Deadpool. Not good. But the one, there's Dirty Harry,
Magnum.
And then there's Magnum Force, which I think is the one not directed by John Milius directed the third one. Which is Sudden Impact. No, not Sudden Impact. That's it.
Is that what it's called?
I think you're right. Yeah. No, Sudden Impact. I was right.
Okay. Sudden Death.
No, he directed that.
Sudden Death is a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie.
Oh, The Enforcer. That's the one that's directed. No, it's not. God damn it, Steven.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Maybe John Milius.
Why are we going down this whole path of talking about Clint Eastwood movies?
You got to get me back on track, because that's why.
Well,
that's what you're here for.
Well, okay.
But basically, the long and the short of it is they kind of played themselves out, and the studios retook control of the movie making process.
Well, they learned something. They learned what they learned from that era, and stuck. The big guns stuck around. Of course, Spielberg continued to make successful movies, and other people sprouted out of that time. that continued to make successful movies in the 80s. But the other ones, other people didn't make as, like Coppola, though he did make other movies, I don't think he made anything nearly as successful as what he did in the 70s.
His 1980s filmography, I think it's a bad rap, personally. Before I get into that, John Milius uncreditedly wrote Dirty Harry, and then he wrote the screenplay for Magnum Force. So he didn't write.
He didn't direct.
He didn't direct them, but he also wrote the screenplay for The Wind and the Lion, which is a really good film that no one seems to talk about, starring Sean Connery and Candice Bergen. But like you were saying, Coppola in the 80s, he did. Oh man, he did The Outsiders.
Sure,
he did The Outsiders,
yeah.
which I think is really good, which no one kind of gives a lot of love to, but I really love that movie. He also did Another Fish, kind of buried the lead. He did Rumblefish, which is so underrated.
It's a cult film, yeah.
It's so underrated. But he also did what's the movie?
Wasn't
Peggy Sue
Rumblefish?
Got Married.
Was it Rumblefish in the 80s?
1983, and it's an art. Yeah, Matt Dillon, Mickey Rourke, Diane Lane, Dennis Hopper. Nicolas Cage, of course, is in it.
Yes.
Chris Penn, Lawrence Fishburne, really young Lawrence Fishburne. Tom Waits is in the film. That's a great film, shot in black and white. And I think the only color used in the film is for these Rumblefish.
You can see he had to. He went down. He went back to having to make a very small movies compared to what he was doing.
Yeah, he went back to making like indie, like existential films, very much so. Like Rumblefish and The Outsiders are very like young existential.
Well, we
films.
know his most existential film ever came in the 90s with Jack.
Oh, of course. Oh, yeah. He didn't make that. You know the rumors that his director of photography actually made that movie. That's a rumor I've heard for years. I don't know. I don't think it's true. But yeah. But I mean, of course, he made Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is pretty good too. Of course, Godfather Part 3, which not a lot
people
of people
don't like to talk about.
To be honest, it's warranted why people don't like that movie.
Look, most there is not a filmmaker I think that has made all perfect movies. So yeah.
Oh, you mean with a perfect filmography?
There's not a filmmaker that's got a perfect filmography. Not even a great,
you're definitely right.
Not like everybody's got a stinker or something that's lesser than in their.
I mean, honestly, it all depends on what you like or don't like. I mean, Stanley Kubrick is pretty solid.
Yeah, well, yeah, but you're kind of biased on that.
You're very biased as hell. A lot of people don't like Eyes Wide Shut, but I think it's amazing. Also, I mean, Killer's Kiss, which is one of his earlier films, is not great. And then Fear and Desire is not really is a film, but it's a film that he kind of disowned because he made it when he was like super super young.
Yeah.
But that's a different story. He wasn't part of that whole new Hollywood era, although he was making films, but he was making films overseas.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing I want to mention before we check out of here, is of course, the studios, like I said, the studios kind of, now they knew what types of films to make, so now they didn't need the filmmakers anymore. That's kind of how that wrapped that up. But while America was having this new Hollywood renaissance, the 1970s in England was kind of when things were falling apart, and I think like the 1980s in England is actually when they were having their renaissance as well. But they actually had already had a young person's, a young filmmaker renaissance in the 1960s. So when we were coming into our renaissance, their renaissance was going away, and they were going down, and now that they're back, once our renaissance was over, they were having a new renaissance in the 80s. Very, very interesting how, international film history lines up with one another.
Yeah, it's like we copy them or something.
Yeah, probably. I mean as it is,
would they have like Mike Lee, part of the 80s Renaissance? He was
later, but I mean, there was like
I don't want us to go. Never mind.
I mean, we're going down a track like like movies like Gandhi, Chariots of Fire, those types.
We don't
of
need to get
movies
down that
and whatnot.
pathway.
We don't need to go down that track. But go down there, because that's a different episode for a different time, which needs a lot more investigating, of course. But yeah, that's kind of been it. We've gone over so much, and there's still so much to go over, because there's so many ins and outs of the new Hollywood era. But we don't want to go into everything, because a lot of these filmmakers and movies and all that kind of stuff, I think we kind of want to save for other episodes
we
later on.
can definitely expand on some of, take a microscope and expand on certain parts of what we talked about today, whether it be delving into a certain actor or filmmaker. So I would say let's stop it there.
Right.
That's going to be it for this episode of the Cinema Discovery Project. Where can we find you, Andrew?
You can find me on Twitter at Capzilla06, as well as my YouTube channel, Capzilla Productions.
And you can find me on Facebook, Stephen Billings, on Instagram, Cinema Discovery Project, also Letterboxd. I'm always rating movies that I've seen. I'm trying to watch as many new movies this year as possible. I have a list going of new movies to me, new movies I've seen this year, and I'm at about 55, so that's pretty good.
Nice.
And you can find the audio for this podcast on Podbean and Apple Podcasts, and that will be it for this episode. Thanks for listening, and keep on watching them movies.
I know I will.